David Robertson wasn't particularly feeling that well when I recently spoke to him over Zoom, so I'm especially grateful to him for helping me with this project. Perhaps best known to many as a blogger, David himself would say that he is, quote, just a preacher.
Well, David, it's good to see you, and thank you for taking the time, especially when you're not feeling 100%. But I do appreciate your making the extra effort for this.
Yeah, no, it's nice. It's nice. It's an important subject, so I'm glad to do it.
That's great. Appreciate that very much. Just by way of introduction for yourself, for the few folk on the planet who haven't heard your name yet, could you maybe just give a very quick recap of introduction to who you are and your sort of ministry journey?
Yeah, I'm not sure why anyone should have heard my name. I'm David Robertson. I was born in Berwick-on-Tweed, brought up. My father was a farm worker. My mother was a nurse. Eventually moved to the Scottish Highlands, where I had my secondary education in Tyne Academy. Went to the University of Edinburgh, studied history and politics. Went to the Free Church College. And became a minister aged 24 up in Brora in the Highlands for 6 years. Then went to Robertson Church in Dundee in 1992. I was there for 27 years and then moved to Australia to work. Well, now I'm working with Sydney Anglicans in evangelism for the past 4 years. So that basically describes it. If people know me at all, it's probably because of the blog, The Wee Flea, and the podcast that I do, and
Sure.
various media stuff. But yeah, that's it.
Sure. No, that's helpful. That's good. That's helpful. So, David, looking back at the beginning of that ministry journey, how did you sense God's call on your life to be involved in a preaching ministry?
Okay. Well, when I went to I wasn't Free Church. I grew up in the Christian Brethren and then rejected everything, turned away from everything. And when I became a Christian, I went to Morningside Baptist Church in Edinburgh. And then eventually, because of a change in my theology, I ended up going to the Free Church, which really surprised me. I never expected to do that. When I went to the Free Church training of the ministry committee, the insistence of my minister, there were various factors involved. Not least, I had 4 objections to going into the ministry, and my friend David Meredith had really encouraged me. I went to 4 different people with these 4 different objections, and each of them answered them. When I went to the training of the ministry committee, so I was doing fine until somebody said, "How do you know you're called to the ministry?" And I said, "How do you know you're called to the highest calling that there is?" And I said, "I don't. A, I don't, and B, I don't think it is the highest calling that it is. I'm not going to go to my father and say, I've got a higher calling than you." I just felt that wasn't right biblically. Anyway, my sailing through quickly vanished. I was interrogated for about another 45 minutes. The clerk of the training of this ministry committee said afterwards he couldn't stop laughing. But he said the one thing you could have said and you didn't say, because he knew my story, was I had been, a couple of years before, I'd been in a church in the north of Scotland, the United Free Church in Ballantor, and I just got the verse. I'm sorry, the very Highland thing to get a verse. Go stand in Acts 4:20, go stand in the temple courts and tell the people the full message of this new life. And I knew that would be my life.
Wow.
I just knew it. But that was for me. It wasn't for a committee of the church. If I went to them and say, "Look, God has told me this," I mean, how can they, that's not fair.
Sure.
So that was for me a personal thing. If that was true, then the committee would recognize. And they did accept me. But I never thought I'd be called anywhere. And when I went through the college, I wasn't really expecting to be called anywhere. And so when I was called, I was very surprised. And I became a minister when I was 24, which was very young.
But as you began, David, and probably before you began actually getting into preaching, who were the men that really influenced you, that sort of shaped you, that maybe go on shaping you, but the men who really molded you into being a preacher?
Well, at the beginning, well, that's interesting to think. I guess your own minister. So my
Mm.
minister in Buccleuch Free Church, Alistair Ross, was remarkable.
Mm.
He was incredibly succinct,
Mm-hmm.
but lots of information. So I loved his preaching. I found Donald MacLeod, sadly recently deceased.
Yeah.
There were times, I mean, I heard him at the Strathpevor Convention one time and just thought I'd died and gone to heaven. He was just very inspirational.
Yes.
Eric Alexander, the same. These were the kind of sort of great preachers that I knew. But to be honest, it was, I don't know, it was just people who fed me Christ. And maybe, when I became a minister, I decided, I was so young, so I thought, okay, and I've done that. I don't still do it, but I did it for many, many years, for decades. I read a book on preaching every year. So Martin Lloyd-Jones preaching and preachers and others. And strangely enough, I listen to preaching a lot more now than I used to. I think that's partly because of the internet.
Yeah.
I'm able to do that.
Yeah.
So more laterally, the likes of Sinclair Ferguson. Again, someone who's recently died, Tim Keller.
Yes.
Was a huge influence on me, mostly because he articulated what I already believed, but he articulated it so much better. But at the end of the day, I actually think most of my favorite preachers are dead ones.
Yes.
So I didn't hear them, like Calvin. I've always read the early church fathers, and I've always read the Puritans, and I think probably the Puritans, John Flavel, Thomas Manton, they for me are the model of preaching.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 We've lost something of their. I can't even define it, but I know what you mean. We've lost something of their touch with God.
Well, they were surgeons of the heart, is how I'd put it, or doctors of the heart.
Yeah.
And so very theological, but very. There were people as well, like one of my elders in Brora, a man called Ross MacLeod. He could preach really well. But yeah, I don't know if I've ever had hero preachers. I mean, the only people I would listen to regularly, I listen to Sinclair's podcast, but I probably listen to one sermon of Tim Keller every week, and one of Alistair Begg every fortnight.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I listen to my own son every week, but I suspect it's very hard when it's your own family, but I just love the way he preaches to working class people, and I haven't seen much of that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So there are other well-known that you would hear. Sometimes at conferences you go, and then they might be great writers, and you go and hear them, and you think, oh,
yes,
that great preacher,
I know what you mean.
One who wasn't like that was Stott. I mean, I only heard Stott a couple of times, but I just thought he was absolutely marvelous.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So I guess that's
sure. But as you look back now, David, knowing now what you know, what advice would you give your younger self starting out as a preacher?
I guess stuff that you hear but you don't take in, which is like, don't try and say it all at once.
Yes.
I think Eric Alexander's advice to me after I went to Dundee, I'd been there about 4 or 5 years, and we had a congregation of 7, and it started to grow. And Eric used to come occasionally because he was in St Andrews, and he asked to see me once, and I went to see him. And again, he's another one who's passed on. And he said to me, David, your church is going to grow. People are going to come because of the preaching. And he said, you're going to come under enormous pressure from Christians to tone down the preaching.
Oh, really? Okay.
And that was, I didn't believe him, but he was right.
Yes.
And so I would say, I think there's a tendency when you're younger, because I really want to be involved with people. So I think I've seen two extremes. I've seen guys who spend 30 hours a week on a sermon, which is crazy. So I think if you're a preacher and pastor, I think you should spend a lot of your time, you should spend, the standard thing, morning preaching, even afternoon visiting, evenings reading is how I would put it.
Mhm.
And of course, you've got church meetings, you've got administration and stuff comes in.
Of course.
But the morning preparing for preaching.
Mhm.
The other thing I think I would say, particularly is a big temptation for a lot of people, is to do reading that's only connected with preaching. And even reading the Bible, you're just thinking all the time about what you're going to be saying.
Yeah.
I think that at least half your reading, and more than that in terms of your Bible reading, needs to be for your own benefit and general use and not for specifically preaching.
Yeah.
And I think as you do that, you build up a reservoir of stuff
Mhm.
that you become, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's some practical things as well I'd probably think about. I would suggest one of the things is, I mean, do you want me to say a couple of those? Or?
Please do, absolutely, please do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, have a very good filing system in terms of quotes and stuff, because I used to think, oh, I heard this somewhere. And then
Yes.
people would start challenging me. Well, who said that? And memory can be. So, I mean, it's easy enough with the internet. I don't rely on Google or anything like that, but when you read something yourself, so I
Yes.
highlight things in books
Yeah.
and, keep a good record of them and all that kind of stuff. I think preaching always needs to be in mind with Christians and non-Christians. I'm reluctant
Yes.
to divide sermons into evangelistic and
Yeah.
non-evangelistic. I think it should be both.
I agree. Yeah.
And I think a lot of the advantage of preaching in one place is that you're preaching to your people, to the people who are there, not the people who are not there.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew one guy who every sermon he used to have a go at the Catholics. Now, not only were there no Catholics in his congregation, there were virtually no Catholics in his parish.
Yeah.
And it seems such a crazy thing to do.
Yes. Yes.
So my personally, I would say always preach to the people who was there and always seek to bring them Christ.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That I know we had this lovely, in fact, she's still alive, so I won't say her name, but this lovely older lady who'd been a missionary in my congregation, and every now and then she'd come up to me and she'd say, "I don't think there was enough of Christ in that, David." And I say, "Okay," and she was usually right.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Mm.
David, as you view the preaching scene, and you have the advantage of seeing it from your side, your present side of the world as well in Australia, and your overview. And I know you keep a pretty good handle on what's going on here. I'd be interested to know what encourages you about preaching, as from your perspective, and what discourages you, or what bothers you, if you like, what concerns you. I'd also like to know, just an adult, if you notice a big difference between where you are in Australia and where you were in Scotland. That's a big kind of question. I appreciate that.
Kind of dreading you asking both those questions. So let me see how honest I can be without being rude. I think my general concern is, so ChatGPT, I think ChatGPT could write most evangelical sermons. And that bothers me enormously.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've become incredibly formulaic. So on the one hand, you have the likes of Mark Driscoll, who went and studied about 50 stand-up comedians. And that's a particular style, that he would take an hour and 15 minutes to say what someone would say in 15 minutes, but it was hugely entertaining. And he was a very effective speaker, and a lot of people copied that.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, let me be the kind of positive thing first. There are people like I'm going to a church here, NCA in Narromburn, Camry Anglican, I think, and the preacher's a very humble guy called Wall, and every time he teaches me God's word and he applies it, and you come away thinking that God has spoken, which that absolutely thrills me.
Right.
I love the way that my son preaches very biblical and sermons that a lot of middle class congregations would say, "Oh, that's a bit much."
Mm-hmm.
But he does it to working class people with virtually no biblical background, and they lap it up because it's warm and it's compassionate, but it's not dumbed down, and I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of things like David Meredith's Old Testament narrative style preaching in the Free Church, or the Sinclair Ferguson, who would always start off, and I used to say to our students, who hadn't a clue who Sinclair was, which for us older Scots was just unbelievable.
Yes.
But they would turn up. I remember one guy saying to me, "Hey Dave, you better watch yourself. The old guy's pretty good." I tell you what was even funnier was one man said, "David, I used to go to the Tron when Sinclair was there, and he said, I cannot believe that you and he are together. You know, because Sinclair was my assistant for a wee while.
Yes,
I
yes,
said, I
right.
just cannot believe this. I cannot believe it." And then he said this. He said, "Sinclair takes us up to heaven, and you bring us back down to earth."
Brilliant.
And then he realised what he'd said.
Yes.
And he said, "Oh, I didn't mean." And I said, "No, I know exactly what you mean, and I take it as a compliment. Don't worry."
Superb.
But so there's a lot of good preaching around. However, I think there are a number of significant problems. A few years ago, I think it became true that when students went to a city, they no longer asked, "Where's the best preaching?" They asked, "Where's the best worship?"
Yeah.
And they meant sung praise, style sung praise.
Yeah.
And I thought that was unbelievable. It was Sinclair Ferguson retired to St Andrews, and I said to the St Andrews CU once, "Why don't you have Sinclair?" It's not Sinclair, but sorry, Eric Alexander it was. Why don't you have Eric Alexander? And they said to me, "Who's Eric Alexander?" I said, "He's the best preacher in Scotland or the Western world, probably."
Yeah.
And I said, "He's in your town." And I just thought, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's that aspect. And then there's another thing. I think we live off the past a little bit. So what I mean by that is, so let me take two denominations. One is my own back in Scotland, the Free Church. Free Church has a reputation. At least people say, when we were just Psalms only, they would say, "Oh, the Free Church can be quite dull, but at least you'll get sound teaching and good preaching." You put up with the rest because of that. I don't think that's true in general. I think that there are some good preachers within the Free Church, but I think the standard of preaching is not great. And Sydney Anglicans have exactly the same. We've got Moore College, we're really sound. And I don't think there's a lot of great preaching here. I really don't. I mean, I love listening to a friend of mine here, Simon Manchester, who's just an outstanding preacher. And it's funny, he preaches, and people come from all over the city to hear him. But I've done some work with city centre churches, and all of them are struggling to attract people to come into the city. And I keep saying to them, it's outstanding preaching, but that draws people. But I'm pretty well certain that most evangelicals don't believe that. So I think our preaching has become quite mechanistic, often filled with memes. I think maybe this is like the kind of Highland Celtic thing. I think a lot of preaching is not passionate at all. I think of, I remember hearing Geoffrey Thomas from Wales once, and he just going, "I have seen the sun, I've seen the sun." And it was just incredible. And Donald MacLeod was very passionate. I'm not saying a false kind. If you're, I mean, Lloyd Jones in his very deadpan way, in one sense, was also incredibly passionate.
Yeah, I agree.
He didn't do a lot of shouting, and so I think that I'll not say who, but a well-known English evangelical, an older man now, said to me once, "David, sometimes I can't be bothered getting out of my bed on a Sunday morning. It's so dull."
Yes.
And
I can imagine what you're talking about. It's like,
and I just thought, I was looking at, I'm going through Colossians, and Paul talks about giving a commission to present the full Word of God and so on. The Word of God in all its fullness. I've just been looking at that today, actually, on this. And I was just thinking, you want that preaching that is thrilling. And it's not always going to be that. I can think of several times in my life when I've experienced it listening to others. I think we had a handful of occasions in Dundee in particular where there were services, the whole service, but the stillness afterwards was astounding. And I think we have forgotten. I think we pay lip service to the foolishness of preaching, but I think we have forgotten that. And, I do think, sorry, I was mentioning Sinclair, and I should have finished the thing. What I was going to say was, I would say to the students who came to us, because they didn't know him, I would say, guys, give him 5 minutes. Hang on for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, because in one sense, he was always a slow starter. But I could hear Sinclair preach for an hour, and you would think it was five. It was 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It was astonishing. And everybody, or Dick Lucas came to us, and I just thought, here was this posh English guy, and working class Dundonians absolutely adored him.
Yeah.
That kind of preaching communicates across class.
Absolutely.
And across barriers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah.
So I do think, yeah. Anyway, there's lots of stuff. I think the quality of preaching is on the decline, and I'm not doing that in a sense of setting myself up, because sometimes I genuinely, I'm not just saying this, sometimes I genuinely think, can I even preach at all? And you wonder in this world, but I genuinely believe that preaching is the means by which God communicates Christ.
Totally, absolutely. But just picking up one of your points about an awful lot of preaching is not good. I found that quite interesting, and I completely agree with you. And I think one of the big things missing is what you call passion, because one of the problems is some of the preaching that I hear and possibly do myself, it's exegetically sound but lifeless. So there's a great emphasis on getting the text right, but it could be a lecture in a theological seminary, but it's lifeless, and you could read it in a book. And so there's a great emphasis on being sound in the preaching and the expositional preparation, but then it's dry as dust when it's being communicated.
Yeah, but my fear is as well is it's not just sound, but there's a certain style and ethos we're expected to have.
Okay.
So, for example, I was preaching at a conference here, and afterwards I was speaking to some of the young people, and it's a young guy about 25, I think, said, "Well, I'm not sure that was preaching." And I said, "Okay, what do you mean?" And he'd been trained at Moore College, and I knew it wasn't the style. And I said, "Do you think it was?" I mean, we had a discussion with a whole bunch of people. It was a very good discussion. Was it biblical? He said, "Well," he said, "you didn't say anything that was wrong." I said, "Did people listen?" He said, "Yeah, these people were listening." He said, "But maybe there were too many stories, and maybe there was. Maybe that is a temptation for me." And that, incidentally, as a preacher, you've got to be careful of, because when you tell stories, the stories that you know to be true are the ones that often involve you.
Yes.
But then you end up talking about yourself quite a lot. At least that's what it sounds like. You think you're not doing it. You think you're doing an illustration. That's what I think. Oh, I've got an illustration of this because this happened to me. Da, da, da.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, it seems to be happening to you. So you have to be careful with that. But I mean, he could have been right on that. And then I was taking bits from it. But what he really meant was that it was a bit too emotional. It wasn't the style he was used to, and therefore it couldn't be proper preaching.
Okay.
And I think there are a wide variety of styles.
Absolutely.
So I would say someone, if I'm just thinking back in Scotland just now, I would say David Meredith is superb on Old Testament narrative. I would say that someone like Derek Lamont is very practical. I think Willie Phillip has a certain style up in Aberdeen in the International Presbyterian Church. Gibson, what I've heard of him, I think Single Ferguson's unique. I don't think people should copy him. And a lot of what he is doing is from 50 years experience, and theological knowledge and a huge amount of reading. So you're not going to be Sinclair. Forget that.
That's right.
There are, there are unsung preachers as well. But I think preaching can easily get crowded out with a lot of other stuff, including preparation. I'll give you a story that illustrates that. That says he, having talked about stories. We're in Dundee, and my view is it's the preaching that initially draws people. It's the community that keeps them.
Yes.
But the preaching is a huge. I remember there was a survey done in Edinburgh of growing Anglican, Baptist, Free Church, Church of Scotland churches, and at the time charismatic. And it was a Scotsman, I think, who reported this, that the number one factor in drawing new people was the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I would generally agree with that. People come along and invite my friends, whatever, but it's the teaching. There's a message or something there.
Absolutely.
And I think sorry, where were we going with this? I was going to explain. Oh yes, give you that example of from St. Peter's.
Yeah.
So people were beginning to come. I mean, all we had was the teaching. We were a cappella psalm singing only. We were a tiny congregation in a decaying building.
Mm-hmm.
And so students started coming. Why did they start coming? Because we offered them a challenge, and because we deliberately didn't dumb down the preaching.
Yeah.
Now we didn't make it academic, but we, you had to stick with it. And my elders said to me at one point, we were just discussing things, and they said, we can tell when you haven't prepared as well as you normally do. Actually, they couldn't, but I knew what they were saying. That they were aware that there were times when I was too pressured with different things, and they said, "How can we help you in that preparation?" I said, "Okay, I need to reduce the amount of stuff I do in administration. That's a one man. I was the only staff, and they said congregation of about 50 or 60. So they said, okay, what can you reduce? And I said, well, I do about 25 hours a week administration. Cut that by 20 hours. Well, we found a way to do it because people in the congregation sponsored an individual. They'd say that in those days it was £5 an hour paid. So someone say I'll sponsor for 2 hours a month. Someone said I'll sponsor for 4, etc.
Right.
So we were able to employ someone for 18 hours a month, and that transformed things.
Great. Mm-hmm.
In terms of.
Yeah.
Now, as we grew, the danger was I became a manager of staff and stuff, and I'm useless.
Yeah.
The last person you want to work for is me. But I still think that, particularly if you're doing, and I was doing 2-3 sermons a week at that point, I think as you get older, you tend to do less.
Yeah.
Generally. But I still think preparing fresh and properly, there's a wrestling, so that takes time.
Yes, yeah. That's great, because that feeds into my next question there, which was, what element of preaching, and I involve the whole thing, preparation as well as preaching itself, do you find the most demanding, the most testing? And has that changed over the years, or has it been a constant?
I think that the discipline required in preaching not to talk about yourself all the time has been very difficult. I can't work out whether I'm just a narcissist or just a normal human being, because we all have ourselves at the focus. I think you get helped with that when you are thrilled by Christ. I think losing confidence that you're able to apply the word to people can be difficult. I get nervous when I preach, and if I get nervous, I use humor too much. It's never, my humor is never ever planned. I can empathize enormously with Spurgeon when a woman came up to him and complained, "Mr. Spurgeon, you use far too much humor in your pulpit." And he said, "Madam, you may well be right, but you should be thankful for what I don't use."
Yes.
I can, but I don't, except when I'm doing a bilingual service. I don't use a full manuscript. I find that virtually impossible, especially since I wrote the Dawkins letters around 2007. My preaching has been much more interactive. I've been very used to people interrupting, people asking questions, and that suits me a whole lot better. It's not everyone's style, but it suits me a whole lot better. So I rely a lot on audience response or congregational response. If there isn't any, I find that quite difficult. The temptation, maybe more laterally, was just to repeat old sermons. the temptation is in terms of the preparation, not to do the hard wrestling with some aspects. And I think knowing how, so I used to, I do what I would call contemporary biblical preaching. And what I mean by that is I try and apply the Bible to the wider culture that we're in. And that's become harder because the danger is you ride hobby horses.
Yeah.
But I do remember one woman, she really encouraged me. She came to our church and she said, after a while, I said to her, why are you coming? And she said, well, David, my husband's not a Christian. I am. And she said, and I find myself, I go to churches that are biblical, but they don't seem to inhabit the world that I live in. And I go to churches that inhabit the world I live in, and they ignore the Bible.
Yeah.
And she said, when I came here, you spoke to the world I live in, but you spoke the Bible.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard to do that.
Indeed.
It's hard to do that, but yeah, I would suggest maybe when something goes well. So again, sorry, another story. When I started off, I was a student actually. I remember being in Livingston Free Church near Edinburgh, and I remember being very passionate, and praying, Lord, don't give me any glory, but let someone be blessed through this, but don't let other people think it's great. I remember praying that. I'll never pray that again, because I preached a sermon that was unbelievably bad, like just so bad. And I went to the door, as you do, and I wanted to run away. I really wanted the ground to swallow me. And this woman came out and she had tears in her eyes and she says, you have no idea how much that has helped me. And she went away. I never saw her again. I don't know who she was. I don't know anything about it. And as far as everyone else was concerned, people do this stuff. Oh, don't worry, the Lord can use it. But it was absolute rubbish. It was awful. It was just dreadful. And I thought, okay, my prayer was answered, but I'm not going to pray that again. It was too much.
Yes.
It's sometimes you need good friends. People say about their wives. Well, my wife's very, very good critique, in a good way, in a really good way.
Yeah, yeah.
But I remember one time I was preaching, and my friend David Meredith was up in Smithton, and I knew it wasn't good. I hadn't prepared well enough, Anyway, afterwards, people were nice. And I was up at his house, and he's sitting there beside the fire, and I said, Dave, I'm sorry about that. I said, that wasn't what it should have been. And he said, give me your notes. And I said, okay. And I gave him my notes, and he screwed them up. He threw them in the fire, and he said, never preach like that in my church again. You could at least have done the cliches that we do. You could at least have said something like, "Oh, the Lord will use it."
Yes.
And yet, look, the Lord can speak through a donkey, but we don't bray.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Great.
I tell you, maybe the other thing that's probably the most serious of all is prayer. I have the gift of the gab. I can stand up and speak, off the cuff quite easily. I do a lot of Q&A stuff. I've been doing it for years and years and years. I can do that. But the minute you rely, so this wasn't preaching, but I did an outreach event with the Dawkins letters, and these have been going really, really well. And so this one was on. I was pretty confident about it. I went down. I came back and survived it, but it wasn't good at all. And I came back, and I remember getting on my knees and saying, Lord, I'll never do that again. Because I did go out on my own strength.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And I think the realization that you can do this, but with Christ you can, is absolutely key. So the prayer is the hardest and the most crucial, I think.
Yeah. No, that's helpful, David. Yeah, I appreciate that. There's just one last question, and I really appreciate your insights into all of this. What one piece of advice would you give a young man just starting out, just dipping his toe in the water of preaching, maybe even testing it to see if this is what the Lord has for him? What one piece of advice would you give him? Then he'll look back on it 10 years and say, "Oh, I'm so grateful David said that to me."
Well, I can tell you that, although I can tell you it was largely ignored. I went to a college, which I won't name, but I was asked to speak to some of the students, and I would say there were about 20 in the room. And actually, two of them literally turned their back on me. It was unbelievably rude. because, but I said to them, guys, you've got to be 100% realistic. You're not the next Tim Keller. You're not going to go to a place and people are going to flock to hear your preaching. It's just not going to happen. Now, can God intervene? Yes, he can raise the dead, but this is what we're talking about, what's normally the case. I think you really, really, really have to work at your preaching. And so I would always say to people, I would say, you said one, I can't do one.
Sure.
What I simply say is this: do read one good book on preaching per year. That's one thing. Find yourself some really good faithful critics. Ideally, within your own congregation, people who you trust, who will speak the truth in love. And it's good to get non-Christians and stuff as well.
Yeah.
I would say listen to good preaching from other people. Do that as well. And it's, Stott's thing about have one word in the newspaper, one word in the scriptures. I would say one leg. I would say your ears, what you're hearing, where you're at. Listen to what God is saying through His Word, and go and listen to your people. Love your people. If you love the people, I've seen people who have been mediocre preachers who people have got a tremendous amount from because the preacher loved them and was warm to them and so on. But your preaching can always be improved. I think it was Lloyd Jones who'd said that if he had his way again, he would spend, instead of 4 years preparing and 40 years preaching, he'd do it the other way around. Now, he's exaggerating.
Yeah.
But I think you're never there. And I think especially in today's world, where people's attention spans have been so changed by social media and, phone devices and so on, we have to find a way to paint the scriptures that people will listen.
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't think there is one way, but I do think, people say stories, and that's true. Illustrations, that's true. But I just think it's connect. I'll use a mantra that I use for my evangelism, and I think this applies for preaching. You've got to contact people, you've got to connect with people, and you've got to communicate to people. So when I was seriously ill in 2011, I came back to church. Of course, I couldn't preach because I was in a wheelchair and stuff for a while, and so I was getting to hear different preachers. And my wife summarized it really well. Annabelle summarized it really well. She said there are preachers who've got good biblical teaching, but they just don't connect with people. And there are preachers who've got great connection, but they don't have good biblical teaching. But the people who can connect and communicate the Bible. Yeah. So one example was Neil McMillan was preaching, and I came out and she said, now that's he connected with people and he communicated the Bible.
Excellent. Yeah.
And so I think, the mistake, if you're a person who connects well with people, the mistake is to think that your personality and your connection with people is enough. No, it's not.
No, it's not. No,
it's not. It's not.
Yeah.
They need to hear the word. And you think, oh, I've got the word, I'm communicating the word. Yeah, that's true. But then, to be honest, you could get an algorithm to do that. You need to, you know what I'm trying to say?
I do. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
So preaching's a holistic thing. Sinclair Ferguson used to say this to me. Sometimes we'd be chatting about some stuff, and it was great having him as a more experienced preacher. And he said, what non-preachers don't understand is that preaching is the most physically exhausting thing you can do.
Yes.
And I agree.
Absolutely. I've said that for years. Absolutely. Yeah. I agree.
I would be absolutely drained. And I would say if anyone's watching this who's a member of a congregation, please critique your preacher, but don't do it on a Sunday night.
Yes. Absolutely. Slow despond. Yes.
It may not. They're probably not in a position to receive it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Dave, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Dave, I'm so grateful for you taking the time, my friend. Thank you so much for your insights and sharing from the heart. And I pray the Lord will strengthen you and heal you and get you back fully on your feet again very quickly.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you're trying to do here as well. I do feel different people have different gifts. The more I go on, people think I do, debates and I do media stuff. But at the end of the day, I just feel I am just a preacher.
क्रिस्चियनहरूले पवित्र आत्मालाई इन्जोय गर्दैन भनेर आफ्नो सिद्धान्त बनाएका छन्। कन्भर्जनमा पवित्र आत्मा नआउन सक्छ रे उनीहरूका अनुसार। कन्भर्जन भइसकेपछि बल्ल डबल एक्सपिरियन्स, डबल अनुभव